Let's begin here. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana says due to the underperformance in revenue collection and increased spending pressures, government will continue to borrow around 553 billion rand per year. The borrowing will be directed towards financing the gap between what government spends and the revenue it collects, and to finance the Eskom-debt relief arrangement.
Government spending exceeded revenue since the 2008 global financial crisis. These rising annual budget deficits have reached an extent where the government will have to borrow an average of 553 billion per year over the medium term. As a result of gross debt rising from 4.8 trillion in 2023-24 to 5.2 trillion in the next financial year, by 25-26, it will exceed 6 trillion mark. We now expect gross government debt to reach 77% of GDP by 25-26. This is higher than the level we forecast in February. Over the next 3 years, debt service costs as a share of revenue will increase from 20.7% in 2023 to 22.1% in 2026-27. The cost or interest of this debt for the next year alone amount to around about 385.9 billion. Over the MTF, interest costs amount to about 1.3 trillion.
At the same time, the minister believes that the country's electricity system will improve in the medium term. He says that government recognizes that many who rely on Eskom have faced disruptions and great losses. Godongwana adds that this is why government is helping the power utility with its finances and fixing its power stations. In February, Eskom was given 254 billion rand in debt relief.
As part of the 2023 budget, we announced that Eskom-debt relief amounted to 250 billion from 23-24 to 25-26. The partial takeover of Eskom's debt announced in February was done for two main reasons. The first was to ease pressure on the company's balance sheet and free it to invest in transmission and distribution infrastructure. I must add, in also to increase maintenance. The second was that more than 330 billion rand of Eskom debt was already government guaranteed. Explicitly taking it on this debt would reduce fiscal risk and enhance long-term fiscal sustainability. As we said in February, the allocations to Eskom would be accompanied by strict conditions to ensure public funds are used for their intended purposes.
Let's get reaction now and speak to Dr. Seán Muller, who's at from the UJ Institute for Advanced Studies. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Muller. Let's just start with your reaction to this budget. I mean, you think about the fact that government debt to exceed 6 trillion by the financial year 2025-26.
Yes, thanks for having me, Bongiwe. You know, I think it's actually best not to focus on the numbers themselves, because these are generally very large numbers. It's hard as a normal person to think about what 6 trillion actually represents. The important thing when it comes to debt is the share of debt relative to the amount of debt relative to the size of the economy. So the thing really that a lot of economists and analysts will be looking at is the debt to GDP ratio, which is heading towards about 75% at the moment. Now, there was a time in the past where some people thought that debt to GDP above 40% or 60% was unsustainable. Since the pandemic, people have revised some of those views. Many countries have had large increases in national debt levels. But what we see is in debt repayment costs is really where the problem binds. So, you know, whatever you think might be a sustainable level of debt relative to the size of the economy, we're having to pay interest on that debt. And we can't allow those interest costs to run too high. So what typically informs the fundamental structure of these budget proposals is what the National Treasury thinks is a sustainable level of debt over the long term. And then they adjust expenditure, tax collection, and tax policies and borrowing to try and achieve that. So that's really what's going on at a basic level with this budget policy statement.
And another, area that some have raised as an area of concern, and they continue to raise it over the years, is the issue around the public sector wage bill. And I wonder how government continues to get around this particular one, because it does look like things are not moving on that front.
Well, the problem really is they are moving because they have to move, because public sector wage agreements have to be struck, and then they have to be funded. But you're right. There's a long-standing problem. What tends to happen is that the National Treasury wants to allocate less money to public sector wages than other parts of government, and especially the public sector unions. And so what's been happening is that the National Treasury will kind of budget what it thinks should emerge from the wage agreement. Inevitably, the wage agreement comes out higher. And then what the National Treasury has been doing is then either taking the money from other areas of government expenditure, or what it's been doing is saying to departments, well, we don't care that there's been this higher wage settlement. This is the amount of money we allocated to you, and we'll leave it up to you to figure out how you're going to finance that. What that means in practice, basically, is the government departments have to cut posts, freeze posts, so not fill empty ones caused by resignations or retirements, or even get rid of people. So the problem is that we're having this kind of reduction in public service employment, which is going to impact service delivery almost by stealth. Nobody's really admitting that that's what they want to do, but that's actually what's happening in practice. And I think this is probably one of the bigger failures of the current government under President Ramaphosa. There was a lot of hope when the new president came in that he might be able to pull together different social partners and strike what people call a social compact. And I think the public sector wage bill was one of the particular areas that some of us hoped he would deal with, because that's essentially where you need these different partners to compromise a little. And that hasn't happened. So as a result, we have a number of negative outcomes when it comes to service delivery, but it's kind of being concealed in the rhetoric of the different parties that are involved.
And Dr. Muller, there's something else, of course, that, was quite big as we were listening to the minister today, and that's the issue around the municipal debt when it comes to Eskom. And this, of course, when you look at it against the backdrop of municipalities who are not able to generate enough revenue, to collect enough revenue in order to be able to sustain themselves. Let's talk about how sustainable this is, as now some of the state is being written off.
Right. I agree with you, Bongiwe. That's also a very crucial area. But once again, there are nuances there that unfortunately none of the parties involved really want to be explicit about. So, for example, I've been writing quite a lot about Eskom, load shedding, and public finances. And the reason is because a lot of people have suggested that the solution to Eskom's problems is basically higher renewable energy generation, particularly by the private sector. And the problem with that, as I've been saying for a very long time, is that that's going to increase Eskom's financial problems. It's also going to worsen the financial problems of municipalities. The financial structure of municipalities is such that they raise a lot of revenue from electricity. It cross-subsidizes other things. It has in the past. So when the National Treasury has been giving tax incentives for people to buy solar panels, for businesses to buy solar panels. It's been putting pressure on the Ministry of Energy in order to pass regulations that allow greater decentralized energy generation. And that's great from a load shedding point of view, but it compounds Eskom's financial problems and it compounds the financial problems of municipalities. So that's why this is having to happen. And the interesting thing is that the medium-term budget policy statement kind of frames National Treasury as coming to the rescue of municipalities. It's planning an agreement whereby municipalities can have their debts to Eskom written off, for example, in return for them meeting certain kinds of conditions, which essentially it seems National Treasury will enforce. But National Treasury itself has been part of worsening the fiscal situation of municipalities through these incentives that encourage people to engage in decentralized generation. So this is not actually a surprise. But yes, you're quite right. It is a problem. And municipalities are at the coalface in some sense, in terms of what ordinary citizens see in terms of service delivery. And it's very important that they're adequately financed.
Yeah, and as a final question, the minister talking about the fact that the economic outlook over the medium term remains weak and listing factors such as, the rolling blackouts and poor performance of the logistics sector, high inflation, etc. Does this picture, in your view, looking at the current state of where things stand, improve soon?
No, I don't think so. And I think that's been the case for quite a long time. We've had sustained low economic growth really since the global financial crisis. That was not our fault initially. But there are various local factors that I think have contributed to that. And as long as economic growth stays low, then South Africa is going to continue to have a problem with its levels of debt and debt repayment. But at the same time, it's also important to remember that it's not just a matter of then trying to cut expenditure and reducing these debt payment costs and these debt levels as a consequence. These decisions impact on the societal fabric. So, for example, I think when it comes to the social relief of distress grant, I think the continuation of that grant was a good thing, even though it's going to make the fiscal situation more difficult. But it's essentially one of the few lifelines for adult South Africans who don't receive any other kind of support, who can't find employment. So, it's also really important that in trying to find a stable debt path for the country, that we also don't inflict harms on the country that are going to undermine future economic growth, undermine social and undermine societal stability. So that's the really difficult balance to be struck.
And difficult balances then, even as we think about, we're now looking ahead to February, and I wonder, what are some of the more, balances that are going to need to be struck here, and if we'll be able to juggle the balls. But let me thank you for your time, Dr. Muller, do appreciate it. That is Dr. Seán Muller, UJ Institute for Advanced Study. And let's also, of course, continue to monitor, in fact, to unpack this for you, because one is not only the issue of municipalities who have their debt that is now going to be written off. Of course, you think about the fact that what happens now, because these particular municipalities also need to improve the revenue collection on their own and make sure that things are sustainable in that particular regard. But let's stay with this and also speak to Ernie King, who is with One Road Consulting, and he's the MD there. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to start with your reaction first to the budget statement.
Hello, Bengi. Where the reaction is one of concern, especially when we look at the debt to GDP ratio of 77%. That is quite a concern, because what that means is most of the taxes that we are going to raise into the future is simply going to go to pay for the interest on that loan, which of course crowds out the taxes that are left over for societal needs. So if we look at the emphasis by the minister's emphasis, quite rightly, is we need higher economic growth. And that high economic growth is essential because, as the president has said in the past, government doesn't create jobs, business creates jobs. And the government's primary task is to create conditions that will enable the private sector to grow, access new markets and create new job opportunities. So higher economic growth is essential. And why is that? It's because we need more taxes. And the budget process, for most people, is a little bit of a mystery. It's a bureaucratic process. But in its simplest term, the budget is simply about baking a cake. And that cake, the ingredient of that cake, is primarily from taxes. And who provides most of that taxes? It's individuals, you and I, and people that are watching. Because we as individuals contribute 70%, close to 70% of the tax revenue that goes to bake this cake. And that's through personal income taxes and VAT. Companies contribute about 20%, and the balance of the other taxes are 10%. Now, the cake, once it's baked from these taxes, government takes that cake and it slices up that cake and it distributes the slices to the country as a whole, and for the benefit of the country and for the benefit of the taxpayers. Why? Because most of that tax, 70% of it, comes from individuals.
And Ernie,
it's distributed through service delivery, through schools, through roads, dams, rail transport, law and order, and power. And all that is required for economic growth. And the problem that we have is that most of that cake is wasted.
And I want to stay with that very point that you're raising right now, because it's critical. I mean, you think about the fact that if this particular cake, the huge chunk of it, you've alluded to this, that if it goes towards the servicing of debt, as we heard even earlier on from the minister, it now means that these societal needs, these service delivery needs that need to be catered for are going to continue to suffer, because now it means there won't be any money to carry this out.
So we find ourselves in this bit of a vicious circle where there's not enough tax revenue that's raised, and government then has to raise more borrowings. And the more borrowings it raises, the more interest it has to pay, and the more and more tax has to be allocated to pay that interest. So if we look at the examples, not only of municipal debt, but if we look at Eskom and we look at Transnet, as far as Eskom, the government is going to give Eskom debt relief. That's 254 billion from 2023 to 2026. That's a big slice of the cake that's going to write off the Eskom debt. If we look at Transnet, which is bankrupt, and the minister estimated that the lack of capacity at Transnet is costing us about 50 billion. With the greatest respect to the minister, I think it's clearly much more than that. I think probably double that at least. And the loss to Transnet from the Richards Bay coal terminal line not working properly is to Eskom, is to Transnet itself 6 billion. So the concern is, as far as VAT and personal income tax is concerned, that is already sitting at about 70%, maybe 68%, 67%, but it's close enough to 70%.
Yeah.
How much more can you rely upon individuals to fund the ingredient of this cake?
And especially,
what we need...
Yeah. Pardon me for coming in there, especially because we're hearing that now there's a budget, of about 15 billion rand when it comes to increases, when you think about February, for example. And I wonder if households are going to then be able to find this sustainable, to be able to continue to cope, given how difficult things already are for most households.
It's going to, if the minister, because of just pure financial constraints, is not able to provide the inflation relief on taxes, on what we call fiscal drag to individuals, and if he resorts, God forbid, to increase in the VAT rate, then we are in a very, very difficult situation. Government must grow the economy. We're growing at less than 1%, and 2024 to 2026, we expect to grow at 1.4%. That's not even close to where we should be for a company of our size. We have to grow the economy, create jobs, increase tax collection, and we can bake a bigger cake. And then government must, on top of that, ensure that the cake is not wasted. We know from the Zondo Commission that a lot of that cake, a big portion of that cake, is lost through corruption.
And that is the nub of the issue as to, the statement talks about the efforts that have been made when it comes to trying to root out corruption, what the SIU is doing and all of that. But South Africans are asking, is this fast enough? But let me thank you for your time, Ernie. We've run out of time. Do appreciate your analysis. And certainly, as you say, hopefully, the bigger chunk of this, the picture can change. And we do see things being distributed evenly and even making sure that service delivery problems are also being addressed. That is One Road Consulting MD, Ernie King. And